So I'm Andrea Summers. I'm the WIPD's inspector out of Rock Springs, but they asked me to come and present this stormwater. My district in Rock Springs, I cover Carbon County, Uinta County, Sublette, Sweetwater, and Lincoln County, so I have a pretty broad area. And I do a lot of stormwater. That's most of my job. So I do a lot of industrial, a lot of construction, stormwater. Your inspector, I'm going to make her stand up and embarrass her, is the inspector in this district is Jessica McConnell, and her office is here in Casper. And so, you know, she's kind of your local go-to source. But if you happen to be in other parts of the state, we have different inspectors, and we have lots of our inspectors here, a couple from Sheridan, and our inspector from Cheyenne are here today as well. And so if you have any questions, they're all sitting up here kind of in front. You can, you know, point them. Any one of them can answer your questions. Yeah, I'm going to throw you all under the bus. You didn't know that, right? Before I kind of start my presentation, which is on inspections, compliance, BMPs, I did want to show you, because Barb mentioned our new website with the DEQ, and it's not terribly easy to navigate or to find things. So I thought I'd show you where things are so that if you need to find them, you can, because, you know, over the phone trying to say, yeah, go to that gray bar on the left, that doesn't always work. So this is the home page, and then if you need anything, in water quality, you're going to select that tab right up there that says water quality. And then you'll get to a page that looks like this, and it has a little introduction. But what you really want is everything over here on the left. You guys are going to go to WIPD's, because that's where stormwater falls under, and discharge permitting, because it is a discharge permit. And then down here, a little bit lower, under discharge permitting, it says stormwater permitting. This will take you to the stormwater page. It's got all of the general permits. So the ones that you're going to worry about most often are going to be the large construction, the small construction general permits. Although we do have an industrial stormwater, and we have mineral mining. And, you know, depending on what capacities you fill, you may need those as well. And then this is where they talked about the MS4 permit, and that link will actually, if you click on that and you scroll down, you can find the map for Casper's MS4 permit, the boundary map, and it's right there. So if you're curious whether your project falls in that, that's where you can find that information. And then if you just click on the link, it'll take you to the construction general permits. And there are a ton of resources here. There's the general permit that you can access. It's a great place to go. Notice of transfers, notice of intent, notice of termination, all of those forms you need are right there. It also has a small construction general permit, and the stormwater pollution prevention plan template. That's a pretty good resource, and we're going to go through that today. As I go through my presentation, you actually have a copy of that template in your packet, so if you want to find that, that might be helpful for you in the next couple minutes. It has the map of 2-year 24-hour storm events. If you work outside of Casper, it may be different. So here in Casper, we found that it's 1.6 inches. If you come to Rock Springs, 0.9 inches of rain is that 2-year 24-hour event. So just a little bit of difference. It depends on where you are in the state. Waivers, stuff like that. Did everybody find, it should say SWIP template at the top, maybe towards the back of your papers.
There's one thing I want to say before you start.
What?
I want to go to one thing on the last one before you
Oh,
start this one.
perfect.
It'll look something like this.
Thanks, Jim. Yep. And if you access it online, it's actually a fillable PDF, so you can type right into it. But for the purposes of ours. All right, Jason had something he needed to add.
Somebody asked me on that last break about the insurance requirements that we require that needs to be submitted in our office. That's actually outlined in our code how much it is. It's under the 1260 part of the code. Businesses and it's providing, they must provide liability coverage in the sum of $250,000 to any claim arising out of a single occurrence, and an aggregate sum of $500,000 for all claims arising out of a single occurrence. So those are the two major numbers that we like to see on the permits as far as how much you're insured for. And what it has to be insured for. So it's for a single claim. Those are the amounts that need to be in your insurance policy to be able to get a permit from us. So that was a good question. But again, a lot of that is outlined in our municipal code. And I'm getting that right out of 1220 on the code itself. And again, a lot of your insurance policies are usually for a year long. If your project goes for over a year, you need to resubmit your new insurance policy to us so it can be on file. And those numbers don't change; they're still the same numbers for year to year. So that was a good question. So, you guys have any other questions like that as we're moving on? Just definitely let us know.
So, like I said, this section is more on what to expect during an inspection, and Jason looks for a lot of the same things that we look for. So there's not a whole lot of difference between what we're looking for and what they're looking for. So if you're compliant with us, you're probably pretty compliant with them. And it's easier to keep up with as you go than try to do it either after the inspector's shown up or right before, so kind of keeping up with things is a little bit easier. Just as kind of a general question, how many of you are contractors? Because I wasn't sure. We've got several of you in the room. This will be geared a little more towards you guys because you're going to be out there on site. So, and feel free to ask any questions as we go through. All right, so kind of the point of what this presentation, you need to know what's in that permit. So getting the permit is not the end of it. It doesn't just go in your job site trailer. You are legally bound to follow that permit. So know what's in it. If you have questions, we are more than happy to answer your questions. You can give Barb a call. You could give me a call down in Rock Springs. You could give any of the WIPD's inspectors a call. They would be more than happy to help you out if you have questions on it. I mean, we would like that much more than coming out to your site and finding things are a mess. So, how do you develop that compliant SWIP and how do you keep it compliant? Because how many of you are like consultant engineers that write those SWIPs? Okay, so sometimes you give them to the contractor and then the contractor never looks at them again. And that contractors, you are bound legally to that SWIP. So if you don't know what's in it and you're not following it, that's a violation. So you need to know, basically the SWIP is, what did you agree to do? What did you say you were going to do? So if you've hired a consultant to put it together for you and you paid them good money, know what's in it. Know what's in it. And then, being ready for an inspection from the DEQ or the city. And then I'm going to go through a lot of what we see are common errors. When we're out on inspections, what problems do we see? What do we see in paperwork? What do we see? What do we see in on site? So, like I said, just getting your permit is not the end. And I'm going to skip through this because I don't have copies of the permit for you all. I thought we would have them here today, but we don't. All right, so there are two parts to an inspection. There's a records review part, and we're going to look at, you need to have the permit on site, and the permit is this nice big 38-page packet. That needs to be on site. That gives you all the rules that you need. Do they need to have the city, they need to have that yellow card stock for the city. So you've got to have that posted somewhere. You need to have a copy of this permit. You also, once you have submitted your permit and it's approved by DEQ, you will get something called a letter of authorization. It's just a single sheet. It will tell you when specifically you are authorized to start construction under that permit, so when you can start discharging under that permit. It also will give you your termination date, which you have selected when you submit your permit to Barb or John in Cheyenne. And like I said, you get to select that termination date. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Don't put that termination date is the day that you end work. Because if you do that, you're not going to have that site probably stabilized and you're going to be discharging without a permit. So you don't want to do that. And I think Barb's going to talk about that when she talks about terminations. And then there's the field inspection. And that mostly consists of what BMPs do you have in place? Are they well maintained? What does your site look like? So 2 parts. All right, so why do we care that you have a SWIP? Well, the SWIP tells the DEQ what you've agreed to do. It gives you a plan, and having a plan is pretty important. So there was a contractor who didn't have a plan. They didn't put any BMPs in place. They were adjacent to this guy's property. So in photo 1, this guy had a really nice little fishing pond that he had stocked and things were great. And construction site moved in next door to him. They did not put any BMPs in place. All of the sediment from their site washed into his little fishing pond. They spent, I don't know how many thousands of dollars because they had to go fix his fishing pond. So they had to dig it out. They had to take all of the sediment back out of it, and they had to restore it to what it was before. It would have been a whole lot cheaper to put in BMPs, to have a plan, to know what they were doing, than it was to fix what they broke. And you are going to be required, if you cause problems, to fix what you break.
And somebody asked in the last section, how far down are we required to clean up? If you create a problem that goes into the North Platte, you are required to clean up anything as far as it goes off your site. If we can pin it to your site, you will be required to clean it up all the way down to the water body itself. So it doesn't matter how far away it is. If it's coming from your construction site, we will definitely make you clean up everything that comes off that construction site. There's no limit to how far away that goes from your construction site. So just keep that in mind. You want to keep everything as close as you can to your site. Because the farther you get away, the harder it is to clean up, the more expensive it gets for you guys. And it just makes sense to keep it close.
Yeah, save yourself a headache and some money. You know, save yourself unhappy neighbors. You don't want that. So your plan avoids problems, and all of these photos are from sites. So, I mean, you see the nice little storm sewer inlet here that they've plugged. You see it going in. I don't know if this is the North Platte or not. It is the North Platte. You see construction. They've created a nice little sediment bank there from a construction site going into the North Platte.
So we would, on this site, we would require you to clean all the catch basins. You'd have to go into the North Platte, get your permit so you could go to the North Platte, clean that out.
Storm sewers as well.
And the storm sewers itself. We would make you jet out and clean all the sediment out of all the storm sewer pipe that went from point A to point B. So there's not a limit on how far away we would require you to clean it up. Basically, your limit is everything that comes off your site.
All right. And on top of that, you know, you're going to have some fines and some issues as well. So, like we said, save yourself a headache. All right, so what information is required in the SWIP? If you choose to use that SWIP template, either to type into it or to use it as a guide if you know you're a consultant, these are the things you have to have in that SWIP. And as inspectors, we are looking and making sure that you have all of these sections and that you've covered them adequately. Because if you don't, your SWIP is incomplete, it's not a very good plan. So you have to identify the people who are responsible for doing things on your site. Who's your SWIP administrator? Who's going to be responsible for inspections? Who's going to be responsible for BMP maintenance? Who's, if they're going to do it, they need to be in your SWIP. If it changes, you need to change your SWIP. And you'll hear that a lot throughout the presentation. Something's on-site changes, you need to change it in the SWIP. Your SWIP is no longer good if something's changed and you haven't updated. So make sure you're changing that in your SWIP. So you're, if somebody left and you replace them, you need to either identify you need to either identify it by job description or you need to identify it by name. So it's up to you, but it needs to be updated. We have a site description, and we'll go through these in more detail as we hit each section, and I'll talk about, the issues with them. What BMPs do you have in practice, or what BMPs are you going to use? Maintenance of your BMPs, maintenance schedule, inspections, what's your inspection schedule going to look like? And then the final part is the signature and certification. And so we'll go through each section little bit by little bit. Like I said, for your SWIP administrator, you need to identify the person or persons who are going to be doing what aspects, which means that, your guy that just started yesterday, unless it's in his job description, you cannot pull him off the street and say, here, go conduct my inspections for me, unless that's in his job description. So,
And that's important because that's the guy we're going to contact. That's the person that we're going to get a hold of. We're not going to get a hold of just a random laborer out there because they might not know what's going on. They might not know what's in the SWIP. So we need to know who you're having as authority over this whole site.
yeah.
It's important for us. It's important for you, so we can keep that communication going.
Yeah.
I just have a question. Like I know on the notice of intent, you've got a spot for delegating authority that you can have on that. If all that changes after the fact, and I know you must update the SWIP. Is having a letter from the SWIP administrator delegating the authority, is that going to be sufficient, or do we need to submit something to the state letting them know that that has changed?
Do they need to submit if they've changed somebody, like their SWIP administrator?
Are you
whoever?
delegating signatory authority, or you just have a different SWIP administrator?
Well, like you may have your property owner who may have the contractor be responsible for the SWIP.
Mhm.
Well, let's say the contractor has, we've got the contractor's name when we submitted the SWIP, but then the contractor decides, oh, I'm not gonna do this, I'm gonna assign a construction site manager or something to do this. But his name wasn't originally on the SWIP or on the notice of intent. So we want him to have the authority to make all those decisions on site and sign. So if we have the contractor write a letter delegating that authority to this person, can we just keep that with the SWIP, or do we need to submit that to the state?
The only time you need to submit to the state if you're delegating someone to sign the inspection reports for the permittee. If you're just saying that Joe who worked for ABC, who was the SWIP administrator, who was going around doing the inspections or whatever, is now going to be this other company, that doesn't matter. Make the change in the SWIP, but that does not have to be submitted to the state.
The only time I would think also that you have to submit it to the state is if you're changing like the permittee.
So the
So
administrator or
the permittee, the person that, usually it's the president of the company or, something like that. If that changes, then that needs to be submitted to the state because that's got to go in our database. But, if you're delegating authority, having that letter with your SWIP and your documentation is a good idea. Because if I see, here's what you have on the state, and then I come to your site and, Joe Schmo was doing this, that, and the other thing, and they weren't delegated to do that, either by name or by position, then, I'm gonna have some questions for you. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question as well. Do you have any recommendations or minimum requirements for how educated a person is on this? The reason I bring this question up is because I've in the past written, filled out these large construction permits for contractors and we pass them on, not knowing if they have anyone that knows what a BMP is, regardless of what else they need to do.
We require that they have knowledge of the site and they have knowledge of the BMPs. And then they have to be delegated, so that contractor, better either have a position, if he says it's gonna be my site superintendent that does all the inspections, then that's what we expect. We're not expecting the laborer, who's finishing the houses to be the one doing the inspections. So we don't have like a minimum education level, but we do require that they be familiar with the site, they be familiar with the BMPs, how to maintain them, those basic things that we're looking for in the inspections so that things don't fall through the cracks. So that would be, and usually, it should probably be your site superintendent or somebody pretty high or higher up the food chain. I mean, not your day.
If they're giving it to somebody that doesn't know, most likely you're gonna be in violation of other things. We're gonna have a lot of conversations with that company.
And there's specific language in the permit along the lines of what Andrea was saying. It's in the inspection part 9, I think. We don't have a specific education requirement, but you have to know how a BMP should be installed, how it should work, when it needs maintenance, what needs to happen when it's maintained.
Yeah, it's section 9.4, which is page 23 in the permit. And it basically says, I'll just read it to you. A qualified person is one who's familiar with the requirements of the SWIP, so they better know your SWIP. They better know the permit conditions. They must be knowledgeable and experienced in the application of erosion and sediment control BMPs and the installation, inspection, and maintenance of those controls as well. Any non-sediment control BMPs identified in the project SWIP as well. So they have to have pretty good knowledge of the permit, the SWIP, and the site. And if they aren't, they're likely gonna miss stuff, so.
Well, and I've read through that before, and that's why I brought this question
Yeah.
up, because it's not black and white to me.
Yeah.
So is it enough for us as the consultant that writes the SWIP, for us to pass on the information of what we put in it, and explain to them how it works and what they're supposed to look for? Does that essentially give them the knowledge that they need to do their job?
It
That's
should. I mean, ultimately, it's not gonna come back on your shoulders. I know sometimes they may come back on you and say, hey, but you didn't tell me this. And I get that. So, that's kind of a level of that conversation you have with that contractor, but ultimately, contractors, it's on you. So if your consultant gives you the SWIP and they say, here are the things you need to do, and you don't bother to read the SWIP and you don't bother to do some of those things, you're gonna be in violation. If you don't know who was designated in your SWIP to conduct inspections, and you're just giving it to whoever walked in off the street yesterday, you're gonna be in violation. So contractors, ultimately, as the permittee, it's on your shoulders. Your consultants are not the permittee.
But I would definitely use your consultants, and we do have a lot of consultants who put these SWIPs together for these projects constantly. The reason why we require the professional engineer to put these SWIPs together is because they have a lot of this education in them, so use them. I mean, you're paying them to put this SWIP together, sit down with them, and go through it with them, make sure you're familiar with it. I mean, you paid them to put it together, you paid them to get it submitted and everything into the queue.
You can also pay them to do the inspection.
You can absolutely
Yeah.
pay them to do the inspection.
You can. We have, especially, like a lot of pipeline companies, big companies, they have consultants that's their job. They know the SWIP. They make sure that their contractors stay in compliance. So, it takes a little bit off of those site superintendent's shoulders. I know you guys are busy and.
It's very common to hire a consultant in other states. It's not so common here, but I wish it would be, because it's really hard for the site superintendent, who's responsible for so much already, to also be worried about the stormwater stuff.
So definitely use their knowledge. There's good consultants out here that do a lot of this stuff, so definitely use them. If you don't even want to bother, just use them. Pay them, use them.
Like we said, I would say, you know, one of the big mistakes is either not identifying the people in your SWIP or assigning duties to people who haven't been identified to do those duties, either by job description or name. And it's your choice. I mean, you don't have to assign a name to it. You can say, you know, this job title, whoever's filling this job title, as long as they have a good idea of the SWIP, they're going to be conducting inspections. That's fine. It doesn't have to be by name. All right. So if you take a look at that SWIP, I generally get a lot of questions, and you know, in that SWIP template, section 8.2.2 tells you what you need for a narrative site description. And you know, I get a lot of this on some sites where, especially if they haven't hired a consultant, I get like 2-word answers to some of these things. That's probably not sufficient. You have to, you know, really kind of set some of these things out. So your nature of your construction activity, what are you building? What are you doing? What's the purpose of this construction? Are you building road? Are you putting in a subdivision? What are you going to do? Then your major activity sequence. And I know, you know, this is what you set out before, and you say, okay, so by August we plan to have the oversight grading done, and then by September we want to have curb and gutter put in. Whatever, you set out dates when you first submit your SWIP to the DEQ to get your permit. But I mean, for the contractors in the room, how many of you have had every project perfectly on time, everyone you've done? I mean, I think a lot of projects are notorious for taking longer than we think they'll take. You know, delays happen. So in this section, if you said you were going to complete your site grading in August and it actually took you till September, when you are doing your inspections, you're going to go back and you're going to change that in your SWIP, and you're going to actually put the date that you finished that particular activity. If, you know, and you need to have those activities kind of listed out. What are those major construction activities? And when are they proposed to be finished, and then when do they actually get finished? Your site area estimate is how big an acreage. This is important. You know, acreage depends on whether you fall under the small construction or the large construction permit. And by the way, this stuff all applies whether you're a small construction site or whether you're a large construction site. You still have to have this SWIP. And so this template works for both. So that small construction between 1 and 5 acres, you can use the SWIP template, and you still have to have all of these things that are required. And then support activity discharges. Those would be like, are you going to have an asphalt? You're going to have a cement batch plant on site? You know, what kinds of support activities are you going to be fueling on site? Those things. So you need to have those listed if you're going to be doing those activities on site. All right, so this is what those sections look like in that SWIP template. And this is how to fill them out. And if you ever have questions on what do you want in this section, what are you looking for, contact us. We take those phone calls. We'd be happy to help you. It's better to do that than for us to get out on site and you not have it. This next part is, you know, you have to, it's going to come when you get done with your project, and for you to terminate your permit. The city of Casper is a little more stringent. They require 100% vegetation, revegetation, so it has to be back to background. The DEQ requires that you have 70% of background vegetation. So it's really important for you to get a good idea of what the background vegetation looks like. Background is undisturbed land. If in doubt, take pictures. That may be the easiest way to do it. Does anybody have ways that they estimate background vegetation coverage?
There's ocular estimations you can do. There's, if you go on conservation website, USDA, NRCS, they'll have some programs or formats in that you follow that will show you how to do an ocular estimate or something like that. But pictures are always the best.
Yeah. So perfect.
That way there's no argument. If they're giving pictures, then we can just say it right there, you know. as far as the city of Casper goes, we're gonna look at the property right next to you and it has to match. It has to be basically 100% for the whole site, not just for spots of the site. It's gonna be a complete coverage.
So get a good description of that existing background vegetation and that whole business of a picture's worth 1,000 words. Definitely helps you there. The next section is your site maps. And I put a poor example of a site map in there. It does not have a whole bunch of the permit requirements. These are all of the things we require on your site map, and your site maps have to be updated regularly. I don't know of any construction sites that look the same when they start to when they end, and any point in between, so you've got to update those. You have to have north arrows. Any surface waters that run through your site or are pretty close to your site, you need to have those surface waters on your map. Where are you disturbing? Areas of disturbance, areas left undisturbed. Storage areas, so if you've got paint, if you've got fuel, if you've got things that are stored outside, those need to be on your map. Concrete washout, and this may change, you know. If you're building a subdivision, you may have concrete washout move constantly as you get houses built and stuff like that. Erosion and sediment controls, your support activity areas that are covered in the permit, those would be things like concrete batch plants that you have. Even if they're not in the middle of the site, if they're somewhere near the site and they're covered under this permit, they need to be on that map. So your map needs to be large enough to show them. Stormwater drainage patterns, where does water flow? And it needs to reflect that. So if your site topography looks one way before you start and stormwater flows one way, and your consultant makes you a really nice map with those stormwater flows, and then you grade things and you change that topography and the way that stormwater flows, your map needs to change. And then where does stormwater discharge or leave your site? And then it needs to be revised every time you make changes to the site. One of the best rules of thumb is take that map with you when you do your inspections and, you know, just draw it in. And it doesn't have to go back to your consulting engineer every time for them to make you a new map. Just take your pen and draw those in and label them. And then Barb touched on this, it has to withstand and function properly up to a 2-year 24-hour event. You are responsible for proving that you had that size event. So you can either use, the local airport weather gauge if they're close enough to your site, or you can have an on-site rate gauge, but you have to prove to us that you had that event if you have a discharge. So you've got to.
And surprisingly, that's a pretty large event. I mean, people don't understand how much water that really is, but it's a really good rainstorm. Most of the time, most of our BMPs that are set up that we see around our community don't even come close to that event. You don't get those events very often, but when we do, they blow them out. They usually blow out every BMP out there. So you need to be conscious of how you stick your stuff in the ground and make sure that it's in there and makes it stable enough that it can handle these events. Not that you're going to have to repair. I mean, obviously something that large comes by and it's going to hit up against your silt fence, there's going to be repairs needed for that large of an event. It's actually a fairly significant amount of rain.
Is there a concrete number for distance away from your site that the gauge is still relevant?
Well, what we say is, we live in Wyoming, so I live in Rock Springs, and I've had it dump on one part of Rock Springs and the other side be sunny. So I don't know how often you see that in Casper, but you know, if you had the event on your site and you're using the airport's weather data and they didn't get hit at all, you can't prove to us that that event happened. So, you know, a lot of times we recommend, especially with really large sites, that you just have a rain gauge on site. You know, it's plain CYA. So, you know,
you could buy one of those pretty cheap at Home Depot.
Yeah.
They're pretty easy to get.
So if you were to have a pipeline, let's say that spans like 200 miles, and you just did repairs on it, so you know you're you're inactive, you still, your vegetation hasn't restored yet. I mean, how would you, and there's no airport around, let's say you're around River Timmon or Sandrock, how would you monitor your rain gauge? I mean, you almost have to foreshadow when you're gonna get a storm and drive out there and look at your rain gauge. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a little bit tougher situation, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good
I
question.
mean,
but-
there are some definite logistical issues with that. You're gonna have to go out and inspect it afterwards anyway. I think, if you have a site that large, you're gonna probably need more than one rain gauge on site,
Yeah.
and just trying to, and then, you can look at other weather data, maybe NOAA has other weather data. Yeah, that's a tough one. It just,
I've used Weather Underground sometimes. I know that there's in the airports also, there's just so many locations, along our pipelines that are so remote.
Absolutely, that one's definitely a lot tougher than what
Yeah.
we typically see here in the city.
One part of the pipeline right away leads getting dumped on, but how would we know to expect a storm then?
yeah.
That sort of thing, we just work with the best we can. NOAA does have a site where you can estimate the rainfall in any given area by radar
Okay.
over this way, but we're not going to say, well, geez, that was 2.51 inches, not 2.53, and so your VMPs didn't withstand that.
Yeah.
We're just not going to worry that closely. If it was a really big storm, and we can't really say for sure it was 2 or 24 hour, because you are out in the middle of nowhere. We'll just try to be reasonable and go out and take a look at the site.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, our biggest ones are, people, especially you have 5 acres in a subdivision and you're using the weather data from 20 miles away. You
Yeah.
can't really
Different.
prove what happened to you happened.
So I would use that NOAA site and just use your best professional judgment. We'll use our best professional judgment, and hopefully they're the same judgment or at least similar.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and NOAA actually, they're pretty good at that. And I've had some sites who've had some major events hit them, and they were able to bring up NOAA, and they're like, okay, here was our precipitation data, and it goes hour by hour. So that was kind of,
Oh, I guess that brings me up to another question. So say that I am able to find that information out, and I have 20 repairs along that whole span of pipeline. What if I had that significant rainfall event happen only at 2 of the repair locations? Would I be required to inspect all of them, or just wherever the rain occurred?
You would just need to inspect where that event occurred. So if you've got 200 miles of pipeline and you've got 2 miles of it that were affected or whatever, you would, as part of your inspections, you would go out and you would look at that section, after that precipitation event.
Okay, thank you.
And keep in mind on the inactive construction, there is no precipitation trigger. That's only for
Yeah.
active construction.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you.
So this section of the SWIP, I get a lot of questions on, and this is where I see several issues, often not enough detail. And there's a difference between your erosion BMPs and your sediment control BMPs. And so we'll go through part of those so you have a little bit better idea to what to expect out of each of those different sections in that SWIP template. So erosion controls keep sediment from moving. Existing vegetation is probably your best one, but there are erosion control blankets. There's diverting water so that it doesn't run through the site and scour. Mulches, tackifiers, all kinds of different ways to control that. Here are some different examples of erosion control devices. This is definitely not exhaustive, but they keep the soil from moving. Wind erosion control devices, those kinds of things.
Our largest complaint we get, if you're from Casper, is always the wind. I mean, we deal with high winds in our wintertime constantly. So that's the one that's the toughest one to keep on your site too. And we actually have, if you're doing a residential construction, there's actually an ordinance in our code that says you're only allowed a stockpile that can only be 4 feet tall. So that's not a very tall stockpile, but that's actually in our code. You can't have it bigger than that. And if you go into an industrial or commercial site, that's obviously not the same situation. But if you're building a house or you're building some residential areas, that's the limit of how high you can have your stockpile. That's our largest complaint, is wind blowing into people's houses and getting into their attics and stuff like that. So.
And if you're living next to a construction site, you don't want to be sandblasted either. You don't want to walk out of your house and, you know, feel like you just went through the sandblasting machine. Nobody wants that. So, you know, keep your neighbors happy. Do the best you can. Sediment controls are designed to keep sediment that's moved from its original spot from leaving your site, entering waters of the state, which includes your storm sewer drains. So these would be your straw bales, straw wattles, silt fence, your wind erosion fence, those wind fences, and you guys require them to put up wind fence,
Yep.
don't you?
We require, basically it's either that orange fence you see laying around, there's the lat fence that you see around. Most of your SWIP plans will say these will be installed every so many feet, or will be a row every so many feet. That's required. We'll actually make sure that you put those up when you're finished with creating your site.
Vegetated buffer strips, if that's going to be your only BMP, they have to be at least 100 foot wide. So make sure between that and where it would leave your site. So if they're not that wide, you have to have another sediment control as well. So here are some examples. Straw wattles. They probably could have used some erosion control up above here. I think they're going to lose part of their road. But those straw wattles are keeping it from going into that waterway that's down beneath. Inlet protection. So just a question, you can show me fingers. Please pick out the inappropriate inlet protection, the one that I don't want to see if I come on your site as inlet protection. So out of those pictures, if you just give me a show of fingers, 1, 2, 3, or 4. You're saying
All except 3.
I'm not talking about maintenance or proper installation, but I would say, for me, it's number 1. That straw wattles laid around. What happens when a big, I mean, how many of you picked up a straw wattle? Yeah? Do they stay in place very well? No. So you get a decent storm event, and it's going to wash that straw wattle away, and you're not going to have any inlet protection. It's going to fill your storm sewer. And in fact, I had a contractor using these, and they filled up the catch basins with sediment. And now they have to go recover that sediment. So
A lot of our common inlet protections, like if we're doing utility projects around town, the contractor usually protects that inlet right next to him, but he doesn't realize that he's on a hill and stuff goes down to the next inlet, down the hill. So you can't just protect the one that's right next to your backhoe or your excavator. I mean, obviously you have to. But you have to look down the street and see where is this water going to be running down this curb and gutter, and you have to protect the inlet downstream too. And that's usually the most common error that we see out of just doing utility work in the city is you have to look beyond your site, not just the inlet right next to your hole or your trench. So keep that in mind when you're out doing utility work in our community. And we don't really allow straw wattles because it'll just go right underneath that wattle.
Yeah.
That doesn't really protect anything.
they are not inlet protection. Use them for something else, but they are not inlet protection. And you know, I get some contractors in my area that they think if they just throw out straw wattles that's going to make me happy. I call that Inspector Eye Candy. It's not really Inspector Eye Candy, you know. I have to get on them. So use, and the other ones, you know, proper maintenance, we'll talk about that in just a little bit, is important. But those are all much better options than the straw wattle. And properly maintained, the other floor actually worked pretty well, so keeping that sediment out. All right, so stabilization. If your site is, or a portion of your site is inactive for more than 14 days, you have to have that site either temporarily or permanently stabilized. So if you come in and curb and gutter's done and they're not building houses on 4 out of the 10 lots, they're not actively construction, they need to be stabilized. So you've got to put something on them. You can't just leave them as bare lots. You're in violation if you do that. And there are lots of ways to stabilize temporarily. You can crimp in straw. You can put down kind of erosion control mats. If it's going to be a really long time before those houses get built on that lot, I'd seed it with something quick growing. But if it's going to be inactive longer than 14 days, you need to stabilize that portion or however much of your site's going to be inactive for that long. And that needs to be in your SWIP. How are you going to stabilize? What are you going to use for temporary stabilization until vegetation comes in? And what kind of vegetation are you going to use? What are you going to plant? Are you going to cover it in gravel? That would be stabilization. Are you going to cover that in concrete? That's stabilized. If you're going to use vegetation, it has to be native plants or grasses. So, and kochia doesn't count. So invasive weeds don't count. So we go out to sites and they're like, look at all this vegetation I have, and I go, and they're all weeds, and you have to get rid of those and reseed. So, and it's, I don't know, do you guys have a lot of it around Casper? Kochia?
Kosha?
Kochia. Do you have a lot of it around Casper? I have. That's everything down around Rock Springs. Anything that's unstabilized grows
So,
that.
on this, she's talking about the difference between what the DEQ requires for stabilization and seeding. And the city of Casper has its own requirements, which is outlined in the municipal code. What it does is it points to a handbook that we've created, and it was adopted. It's significantly actually fairly good reading. This is adopted in our code. This is all online. There's another nice link. You don't have to write that down. We'll give you the slideshows. But this outlines exactly what we require for reseeding or revegetating within the city of Casper. And they only, DEQ only requires a 75%, but we require a complete 100% coverage. It's hard to get stuff to grow in Casper too, so you gotta make sure that it goes. I mean, we're not going to release any of your surety. We're not going to release any of your stuff until you meet our 100% seeding requirements. And all of that is outlined in here. So if you're doing any work in the city of Casper and you are submitting their SWIP to DEQ, you might as well tell them you're going to meet the city of Casper's requirements, because we're going to require it in the SWIP as you submit it to us anyways. So they'll show you where that's at, what this is. It's pretty extensive on the seed mix that you're allowed, how it gets put in the ground. It's 100-some pages. So if you don't want to read this as a consultant or as a contractor, make your consultant read it and have them run your site. But this is what we require.
What about your straw wattles and stuff like that? Do you guys require that to be native?
No. No, not your temporary BMPs. It's that final vegetation, whatever you plant, that seed mix. And they have a lot more stringent requirements, the city of Casper does. But, as far as if you're outside the city of Casper, I know pipelines, whatever, we do require it to be native grasses or shrubs, kind of, those kinds of seed mix. And your seed mix is up to you as far as the DEQ is concerned, but you want to make sure that it grows. So. And
if you're doing a pipeline and you're going through different counties, they may have requirements of what type of seeds you're going to use. You need to get a hold of their county requirements, especially when you're doing 200 miles of pipeline. You're crossing different jurisdictions. Just because DEQ doesn't require it doesn't mean the Converse County doesn't require it, or somebody else doesn't require a certain seed mix. So if you're a consultant working for these big pipelines, you need to at least inform them, hey, you're crossing into another jurisdiction, you need to look at this seed mix.
And an interesting thing about the city of Casper's, you may need more than one revegetation plan depending on your site. So be aware of that. If there are different types of soil or different soil conditions, you need to have a separate plan for each soil type and each special soil condition. So, you know, that would probably, if you're writing up that re-veg plan, just be aware of that. You have to have those. And then there were some other kind of city of Casper things.
Yeah, a lot of our code, you know, monitoring should occur, you know, between August and October. Our vegetation plan, it doesn't even allow you to put the revegetation in at a certain time of year, because we know a lot of it won't ever take. But if you're coming into that time of year within the Casper, we'll either make you crimp in the straw so it can handle it through the winter, or a lot of contractors here will just put that seed down because they figure they're going to have to come back and reseed certain areas anyways. They want to get at least started going through the winter time. That's up to you guys as far as that. Our major really inspection parts are, we're going to go out and we're going to inspect in the summertime. You guys need to tell us too when you think it's revegetated. I can't say that enough because I constantly get complaints that, oh, you guys are holding our SWIP permits, you're holding our sureties, you're not releasing anything. But if I don't know you've even seeded it, or if I don't know that it's supposed to even come to the revegetation, and hopefully we have somebody that's driven around and we've looked at it, but it's your responsibility as the contractor, as the developer, as the consultants, whoever's running your reseeding or your SWIP, to get a hold of us, and we'll meet you out there, you know, within a day or that day to inspect it. We're not going to wait to get it done. We want to get these revegetated as quick as you guys do too. It helps out the neighbors, it helps out your community to get this re-veg as fast as you can. The longer it sits, then the more erosion you get, the more wind it's going to get hammered on it, and the more calls that I have to take. So definitely, once you get it seeded and you think it's re-veg, you let us know. We'll go out there and walk it, and we'll inspect it with you guys. We'll work with you. We want it re-veg as quick as you can. I guess I mean, what else is on there?
I think that's it.
You know, we'd like you to document when you actually do put that into the ground. Like I said, it's in our code at certain times they're only allowed. Again, contractors like to just revegetate. They like to at least get something in the ground, try to get something growing, even if they know they're not going to get 100% that spring or that coming summer. Then they don't have to come back and re-veg a whole big area. I mean, that's typically like what we'd like to see that. Our winters are brutal here with the wind. It gets dry and then it just gets windy. So we'd like to see something in place. You know, and along those lines, we require, you know, fences up. We require the snow fences up. We require the lath fences up. It's just, our winters are just atrocious here. Other than that, like I said, if you guys think you got something done or you've completed something, you need to get a hold of my office so we can have someone out there to inspect your area.
All right, so we talked about sediment and erosion controls. Those are the two big things in your SWIP and on-site. But there are some other areas that you need to include, and those are all in the SWIP template in different sections. Good housekeeping, bulk storage, petroleum products, concrete washout, and then your employee training. So, you know, just, you know, some pictures of some of those operational controls, sanitary facilities. Good housekeeping in Wyoming. We have wind. And, you know, you throw stuff in the dumpster and where's it gonna end up? So you have, yeah. You're in, you know, so if you're throwing little bits of plastic or styrofoam or even cardboard in an open dumpster, that's gonna lift off and, you know, fly a long ways. And so, but you're responsible for recovering that if it leaves your site. That's part of this plan. And I know it's not, I mean, I know it's hard. We have a nice caged dumpster here. Covered dumpsters work well, or just making sure that whatever you put in that open dumpster is heavy enough to stay in there.
And not only is your litter controlled under the SWIP, the city has certain codes just for litter itself. So not only are you gonna get hit by ours with the SWIP plan, if you've got, you know, shingle, plastic wrapping flying across the site, we're gonna hit you that way. But the code enforcement has its own litter requirements with the city of Casper. So they are actually inspecting litter constantly around the community too. We have so much litter around here, it's crazy. I mean, we almost say our city bird is the Walmart sack. It's just constant, everything's flying around. So be conscious of that. And if you're staying for the landfill presentation this afternoon, we're looking at maybe providing roll-offs with lids on them, stuff like that. She'll go into a lot more detail when she's giving that presentation, but the city of Casper is actually looking at providing some more better measures to our roll-offs that we allow in the community, and I think then they're going to partner with DK Holland and see if they can get some other things going on their roll-offs too. So.
And then we also require bulk storage for chemicals and for fuels. These would be common ones we see on site. Just know that your secondary containment for bulk fuels have to be large enough to contain the volume of the largest container plus 10% for 48 hours, or 72 hours. 72 hours. So if you have a 1,000-gallon drum, it's got to contain 1,100 gallons for 72 hours. So just know that your secondary containment needs to be large enough. If you have other paints or other chemicals, paint thinners, stuff like that that are going to be stored outside, exposed to stormwater, they also need to be in some sort of secondary containment so that, you know, if they get punctured, they don't spill all over and run into the storm drains or run off your site. So those pollutants are regulated. This is the biggest one, I think, have lots of issues. Another show of fingers, actually, which one is the best site or best concrete washout area out of these four? Sorry.
We need bigger pictures.
Oh, my pictures were big enough. Honestly, I mean, 2 is a little on the full side, but I would say that's probably your best one. We definitely don't want to see 1. The concrete is, they just dumped, so the slope of the land goes this way. They had a soil stockpile here. They washed out against the soil stockpile. It runs all the way down over the sidewalk and into the street, and then actually on this site, the concrete guys were out there washing their tools in the middle of the street. I was like, really, guys? Can't do that. And then number 4 is another pretty bad one where they wash out against this berm. The sidewalk's right there. It ran right up into the sidewalk. This one actually was out in the middle of the site, so it's not as bad. It didn't have really a whole lot of chance of leaving the site, but 1 and 4 were.
And the reason 2 works out good is you can't really see it in the picture, but it's actually a sunk. There's actually ground. It's actually a hole in the ground, so there's no way anything can leave that hole in the ground. So you're basically washing out into a basin.
Yeah.
That's going to be completely contained, and we can clean it up when you're done. So that's why it's kind of tough to see. It's not a huge deep hole, but they've actually got, it looks like about 1.5 foot deep hole they dug there, and they're backing their trucks and they're washing out into that area.
And, you know, backing up against berms, as long as you've got that berm and it's protecting it from leaving off site, and you're washing out on the side of the berm where things aren't going to leave the site, berms work pretty well as well. But be aware of where you're locating concrete washout sites, and be aware of, you know, where those concrete crews are washing out, because I have a number of contractors. I was at one site, and the poor site superintendent, I felt bad for him because apparently the concrete crews had come in and he had his concrete washout pit set up, and they washed out over here next to the fence, and they washed over here in the drainage. I mean, the poor guy was like, I feel like I'm babysitting here, and I was like, and you're responsible for it. So, you know, anything those laborers do on your site that's a violation, it comes back on you. All right, and then sanitary facilities, cite them appropriately. We live in Wyoming. If the wind doesn't blow them over, you know, the teenagers down the street are gonna lock somebody in it and tip it over, so secure those. Get them locked down to something so that they can't be tipped over. And you wanna cite them appropriately. You don't wanna sit them right next to the storm drain, you know, on the pavement where they're gonna tip over and run off into the storm drain. That's not gonna make your storm drain managers very happy, and us either. All right, so BMP maintenance. You need to have a plan for how to maintain every BMP. It's honestly good if you put it in the SWIP and you have the manufacturer specifications in your SWIP that covers you as long as you're following those. So if the manufacturer says straw bottles should be cleaned out when they're half full of sediment, then when they're half full of sediment, you better be out there cleaning them out. So you have to follow the BMP, that maintenance schedule. If you don't have manufacturer recommendations, you know, when are you going to maintain them? And you have to be specific. Just saying, we're going to maintain our BMPs doesn't work. Yeah, some pretty bad pictures of poor installation and maintenance. This one, number 2, they used one of those sediment trap bags, but they didn't ever maintain it. And so about 1.5 inches of sediment got built up in that sediment trap bag. Then we had a huge precipitation event. It flooded the street around that sediment trap bag because it couldn't go through. And when it flooded, it actually collapsed the sidewalk and the pavement around the collection basin. And so now the contractor gets to not only clean out all that sediment, but they get to repair the street and they get to repair the catch basin and the sidewalks. So save yourself a headache, clean that stuff out, maintain your BMPs. They don't work if you don't maintain them.
And we see a lot of number 4. We see a lot of number 4 around there. That's poor installation and maintenance both together.
A sediment fence with this much gap underneath it is doing nothing. So you bought yourself a really expensive yard ornament.
And a sediment fence doesn't mean you just stick it in and it's sitting there vertically. It actually has to be anchored into the ground. You actually have to anchor those down in the ground so you don't get silt washing under that. You don't get these washouts under it. A lot of times they just go out, again, eye candy. They just throw up this black thing and then from a distance, oh yeah, they got their silt fence up. But you need to anchor those silt fences into the ground so you're not getting them washed underneath.
And I'm going to come out, if I come out on an inspection, or Jessica comes out on an inspection, or any of the other inspectors come out, we're going to actually pull on your silt fence. We're going to pull up on it and make sure it's anchored in. And we're going to look at the lines on your silt fence. And we're going to make sure that they are covered to that line so that nothing can get under them. We want to make sure they're installed correctly. Some more number 1. This one is just running underneath the straw bales, so you probably can't see it, but there's a hole right under here. So they have the silt fence up, but the water's found a way underneath their silt fence. It's got a big hole in there. The straw wattles right here, they're completely full of sediment at this point, so they're doing nothing at that point. And then this one is obviously water's running right underneath that silt fence. So or the straw wattle, and you have to key in straw wattles too. You need to dig a little trench and you need to stake them down. Because if you just lay them on top of the ground, the water runs underneath it, even if you stake them down. So make sure you install them correctly, and the manufacturer will give you inspection instructions. Keep that with your SWIP and follow them. Track pads. This one is one I'm currently fighting right now. They don't maintain their track pad. And I go out there and they're constantly tracking mud out into the street. Well, they've got their track pad, but it's not maintained. It's plumb full of mud, and so what happens when they get, you know, snow melt or whatever, they're just taking all the mud from the site and they're tracking it out into the middle of the street. You have to recover that sediment. So if you track it out onto the street, you have to recover it in 24 hours. Inspections. In your packets, I provided you with an inspection report template. This is one I adapted from the EPA's template, and I made it specific to some of the things that we have in the WIFD's permit that's a little bit different than the EPA stormwater permit. I think it's kind of bluish or purplish when it printed out, but I'm not sure. And it's several pages. The actual template looks kind of like that. It's just like the SWIP template. You don't have to use it, but you might use it as a guide. It has everything that is in our permit and that's required. And this is one of our big paperwork issues. People not having all of the requirements on their inspection forms, and people not doing their inspections like they say they're going to do them. So your inspection reports do have to include all of these items. It's outlined in the permit. It tells you exactly in the inspection section of this permit what you need. I made that template because I had several contractors that are like, I just want something that, you know, that I can type into that has it all. And I just tell them, you know, change whatever you want, but just know that right now it has everything that's required by the permit. If you need to streamline it and make it simpler for you, do that, but don't remove some of those items.
And then we also provided you an even more basic template that you can gear towards anything in your package. It's only one page, I think it's front and back, but it's really basic. I mean, it just kind of outlines certain BMPs, things to sign.
And it's not going to meet the DEQ's requirements.
This one doesn't meet DEQs, but it's just something to get you guys started. But we do require that you have to have these on hand and you do these. That actually, they never get done. So even if you do something this basic, it's something. We still will talk to you about what else you need to add to it, but this gives you something to start with. Like I said, I don't know if I've gone on site and I've seen somebody do this unless it's a project the city's actually ran themselves. So it is a requirement by DEQ. So even if you don't have it for us, DEQ will want those reports too. I mean, it is required of us, but you have to meet the requirements. So we're just trying to give you things to start from. You can create your own inspection report if you'd like, geared to your own site, but we'd like to see something going on.
And it does have to contain all of those things that, you know, are required by your permit. So if you want to use the City of Casper's form, but you don't want to do two different inspection reports, then I suggest you modify their form and you include those things that the DEQ requires in their permit. It's completely up to you, but, you know, we're looking to see that you have everything required. So, you know, our common errors with inspections is that, one, they're not being conducted. You're just not doing them at all. Or you are a different schedule than what you have in your SWIP. So your consultant hands you your SWIP, you don't read it, and it says in your SWIP you're supposed to be doing inspections every 7 days, but you decide you want to do that 14-day and after precipitation events. You're in violation because you're not doing what you said you would do, because that's what your SWIP is. It tells it's what you said you would do. So if you're going to change any practices, change your SWIP. So if you don't want to do them every 7 days, then you need to get into your SWIP and you need to amend it and say, I'm doing them every 14 days and after precipitation events. It has to meet your SWIP and it has to meet the basics of the permit. If it's an inactive construction site, and the permit requires you to do them every 30 days for inactive sites. But your SWIP only has outlined that you're going to do them every 7 days. You're still bound to do them every 7 days. So change your SWIP. Change your SWIP. If you're changing your practices, change your SWIP. One of the things we notice is a lack of compliance statement, and that's, sorry. Yeah. If you look at that template, and you look, it's double-sided at page, it's page 4 of 5 of that template. As you're kind of reading through down here, you'll see, was the site found to be in compliance with the SWIP and the permit? If you don't have something like that on your inspection document, it's not a compliant document. So this one, I would say like 99% of permittees miss. Now you guys don't have to be that one. But Jessica has to write a violation report because you have that missing. So, you know, make sure you have that on your document. And then the other big one, not quite as many people miss this, but I have a lot of them missing this. You have got to have the certification statement, and it's outlined in the permit, and it is this one that's word for word. And this one's actually national, so the one we have in our permit is the same as what the EPA has. So if you're doing projects out of state and you're under the EPA, or if you're on the reservation doing projects, this is the same certification statement. And then it has to be signed by the either by the permittee or the authorized representative. So the person you said could do your inspections. Make sure you have those. So that's that section. So, common paperwork issues, SWIP not current to project conditions. You've changed something on site, you haven't changed your SWIP. That's a big one. Your SWIP doesn't detail your erosion sediment control measures, your BMP, stuff like that. Your site map is not current to your project conditions. Take your SWIP, take your site map out on your inspections with you, and if you need to change things, because things on site have changed, change them there so that you don't forget. Your inspection reports are not signed and certified. You don't have a specific maintenance schedule for BMPs. Sorry. And then you've ended permit coverage prior to final stabilization. You haven't met those revegetation requirements, stuff like that. Site issues, you're not using the right BMP, you don't have it installed correctly, you're not maintaining things correctly, those would be the big ones. You don't have any BMPs at all, or they're missing for something that's a big deal. I'm going to talk about dirt ramps in just a minute. This is a huge problem where I am. Sediment tracked onto paved surfaces, it must be cleaned up within 24 hours. And your sold lots are not in compliance with your SWIP, or they have not been stabilized. It's that common plan of development thing Barb was talking about. If you don't get it transferred over to them, they don't get that large construction permit, they're still in your SWIP, you're still responsible for those sold lots. All right, so this is a big problem in my area. Contractors like to use dirt ramps, moving heavy equipment, protecting those sidewalks from breaking, and then they leave them there for months, weeks. You actually must have this, if you choose to use a dirt ramp, it must be cleaned up by the end of the workday. You cannot leave the site and leave that. And definitely not leaving it for weeks and months. And I know my pictures are hard to see, but the one up above probably was left there for 2 or 3 months. And I showed up on site and they had a mess. But you've got to clean them up. So if you don't want your workers to have to clean it up every night before they leave the site, then figure out a different way to protect those sidewalks, because you are required to clean those dirt ramps up before anybody leaves the site, or before your work for the day is done. And then you get to put them back tomorrow, or whatever.
Andrew,
Yep.
so in that situation right there, what if they decided to install BMPs? Like, let's say they keep it on the sidewalk and they put something right there, it's curved or whatever, that You know, so they may have to, at the end of the day, they might have to go and fix that BMP after all the trucks have ran over it or whatever. Is that, or at the end of the day, maybe they put the BMP up. Is that acceptable?
If it's on the sidewalk, it's technically considered off your
Off-site?
site, yep. So you can't have sediment tracked onto sidewalks or paved surfaces, and that sidewalk counts as off your site. So you're allowed to, have that up for the day, but it has to, you can't put a BMP around it and be like uncovered. So, I don't know if Jessica sees it as a common problem around here, but I see it a ton in my district. It's a common one.
So I guess as far as the city goes, I mean, obviously DEQ is a big department. They only have one person for this whole community, but she's out driving around. The city has several people out driving around. We have code enforcement driving around. We have the engineering departments driving around. Basically, the way our code says is the city manager or his designee. So his designee is the city employees. So if somebody from the city drives by and sees something going wrong that does not meet any of these standards, he can either get out and inspect it as he can, or he can call myself or code enforcement, and we will come out there and talk to you guys. But any city employee is a designee of the city manager. So just to let you know, just because it's not an engineering department guy, he's still a designee of the city. Final inspections will be conducted at the request of the permittee after the construction activity is completed. Like again, you've got to inform us that you're completed. Final approval should not be given until all work, including installation of all drainage facilities and their protective devices, and all erosion control measures are in place, and all seeding is done. Just because you have your BMPs up doesn't mean you're done. You have to have it seeded. Just because you have it seeded doesn't mean it's complete. If there's reason to have erosion measures and BMPs in place until that seeding, that's not done. So you have to have all those in place before we can consider it a final inspection.
When you have final stabilization, go back and remove those temporary BMPs. Please don't leave your silt fence up, until it falls down from.
And that is required in our ordinance too.
Yeah.
Once it's stabilized, you have to pull all of your BMPs out. If you do not pull them out, and it sits there and creates an issue, the city can go remove them and we will charge you. So you don't want us to do it. It's much cheaper for you guys to go do it yourself. No final approval shall be granted until all permanent soil is stabilized and has been and permanent vegetation has been established. Again, that's all based on that revegetation hand guide. It's very stringent guidelines, so I recommend you look at it before you even call me and say that this is final inspection. Because if we show up and it's not even close, we probably won't even inspect it. We'll probably just go back and keep doing with our daily works. We're very busy. We don't want to be called out there if you don't have all of your measures in place to be a final inspection. And again, there is the guidelines to the revegetation plan, and that's all directed in the city ordinance. Authority for the city of inspection. This is kind of in the next section. 12.20 is most of our subdivision guidelines for erosion control, stuff like that. We have several areas within our ordinance that gives us authority to inspect other things. The city manager or his designee may make periodic inspections for the purpose of seeing that this chapter 1349, is complied with, and that it is unlawful for any owner or occupancy of any business, building, or anyone that owns the property or has sold the property. It doesn't have to even be a construction site. We have the authority to go and inspect X, Y, and Z's yard. If there's a stockpile of soil on your own yard that is coming off of your own property, we have the authority to come inspect why anything is going into our storm sewer system. So basically, we can, if it's going into a water body, if you got something going into Garden Creek and you own property up against Garden Creek and we see that Garden Creek is now brown, we have the authority to come onto your property and see why that the banks are eroding or why something is going into a drainage way. We have the authority to come on your property and inspect to see why things are coming into our street, why things are going into our storm sewer systems. So it doesn't have to be a construction project. It could be your own property. It could be anyone's own property. But we have the authority to see why things are going into our waterway. We don't want anything dumping into the North Platte, period. So, there's a lot of areas in our code that gives us authority. We're obviously not gonna do inspections at midnight. We will get a hold of you at a reasonable time that we can come on your property and make these inspections. Enforcement that the city has. If it is determined that the soils are leaving a disturbed area by wind or water erosion, such person may be directed by the permittee on site to install anything that we see necessity to keep anything on your property or your construction site. If you guys do not want to listen to what we would like you to install, we can issue a stop work order. That is outlined in orders. We can actually stop the whole subdivision from working. We can stop a whole site from working if we need to. That's why if we come on site and we see issues, you need to address them. If it's taking you longer, we will keep asking you. If you just flat out are not wanting to listen to us, we will issue a stop work order. We will stop whatever construction is going on site until those measures are in place. If we still have issues, we will have the city's crews come and install them and clean them up, and then we will back charge you for any of those costs. We may stop issuing any building permits for any subdivisions, any sites. We may stop issuing any occupant permits that may be issued to any of these houses, home builders, site plans, any of that. So those are all within our authority to make sure that you guys are following your SWIP plans and you're actually paying up to date on anything that's leaving your site. So it doesn't even have to be a construction site. A permit may be suspended or revoked if the permit is issued in error. So if you've blatantly lied on your SWIP plan and we come out and we inspect it and we find out that you were just blowing us off, we can revoke that whole permit, come in, see everything, and charge you for that. Incorrect information, it goes along with incorrect information. And again, like I said, if you guys just flat out don't want to take care of anything, we will have our crews do it. We will charge you for their time and labor. Okay. She had mentioned it on their requirements. The city's got the same requirements. It's a 24-hour action. So any notice of violation is a 24-hour action. You will get a written notice violation and you have 24 hours to fix it. Any person fined in violation shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor. So there are penalties and fines that go with any violation that we issue to you guys. And that's each occurrence. So if we come on and we give you a violation and you don't get to it, and we issue you another letter and you don't get to it, all of a sudden now we could start issuing misdemeanors per day. It's per 24-hour occurrence. So if every day we come on site and you don't address your issues, that's another occurrence. On each day is a violation and a separate offense. Okay. Here's another area in our municipal code that gives us the authority to inspect anything. Any person engaged in any activities or operations or owning a facility or property which will or may result in pollutants entering any stormwater, any storm drain system, or any surface water of the state shall implement any best management practices to make sure that doesn't happen. So again, it doesn't have to be a construction site. If you own property and you have any pollutants going into any of our systems, we have the authority to make sure that you put in any BMPs or need to do anything to keep that material on your property.
All right, so last thoughts. Read your permit, read your SWIP, know what you've agreed to do, know what you have to do. That's really important. Don't just show them in your job trailer or in your truck and never take a look at them. Follow your SWIP and your city permit guidelines. You are legally bound to follow those, and there are penalties associated with not doing that. Understand what your responsibilities are under the common plan of development that Barb talked about, and you know, just be good to your neighbors. Do what you can to keep them happy. You know, nobody likes getting complaints, so we don't like having to respond to them. People who are complaining don't like what's going on. you guys don't like to see us show up on a complaint. So keep your neighbors happy and do what you need to do.
A lot of the times, the reason why we're coming out is somebody's complained. Like I said, we don't drive every block, and we don't drive every single place in our city, but there's a lot of people that don't hesitate to call our office. So if we're coming out and we've already got complaints, that means there's already an issue, something's already going on, there's a reason why we're there. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an inspection, but there's a lot of people out there that care about their own property and stuff, so we get a lot of those phone calls.
And I put the links up here, but we're gonna try and get you a link page, and so, thank you. And are there any questions for us? I know we went through a lot of stuff, kind of heavy stuff, so. If you do have questions, yeah.
When a permittee wants to change, like the frequency of their inspections or something like that, does that have to be submitted, or can you do changes like that to your SWIP?
You can just do changes to your SWIP. It does not have to be resubmitted to the DEQ. They want it that first time, to get your permit. But, construction sites change. You guys know they change a lot. So if you had to submit it every time something on your site changed, that'd be pretty. So that's why we want that SWIP. Your SWIP needs to be on site and available to inspectors. And so, if you don't have a job, site trailer or whatever, your site superintendent, they can keep it in their truck. You don't want to give it to the guy that's not going to show up to work every day or be on site every day. You want it on site. So, and then it has to be provided to us. If we request to see your SWIP, you have 24 hours to provide that to us so that we can check it out. But yeah, I honestly take your SWIP out there with you, and you could write things into it as things change. When you're doing your inspection, that's a great time to change your SWIP, because you see it right there and you just do it. And that would keep your SWIP and your sitemap updated if you did it that
And
way.
if it's changing constantly and you're crossing this out and you're updating it, and you're crossing this out and you're updating it, when you get a chance to get back to your office or whatever, then you can print out a new one and get it updated. But we will look at it when we inspect. If we see that your reports are kind of insufficient, then we'll say, let me look at your SWIP and see what is required by what you've put in there.
Yeah.
So, to add on to what he was saying there, what if you had your map, if you got to that point where, it's getting so congested, can you just keep a running tab, another sheet in there, just showing the updates and changes, would that be
Yeah.
sufficient?
Yeah, you could do that. The other thing you could do is you could file your map, and you could, if it's getting really busy and you just can't tell what's going on it anymore, you could just, file that, stick it behind your SWIP in the same binder, whatever, and start a new map. And that way you've got your historical record there, and you've got a fresher one that maybe isn't so busy, so you can continue to.
But if you're keeping a running total, make sure you're concise on what you're saying. I mean, that's why we like the maps, is because we can visually see what is going on. So you just need, so you just need to be very concise
And
if
it's
you're going to
things
do that.
like, you changed your concrete washout pit from point A and you put it at point C. So you can just draw a line through your concrete washout pit, put removed and a date, and then draw your new one in. So it's really simple things like that.
So, are you saying that you would prefer to see it on a map as opposed to?
We would always prefer maps because they're so much easier to understand what's going
It
on
needs to be
versus.
in both places.
Okay. that's
You
what
are
I-
required to
that's what I
keep
find out.
both updated. Your site map, if I look at your site map, I should be able to walk out to your site, and everything on your site map and its location should be where it says on your site map. If you've changed other practices in your SWIP, if we were talking about those major sequence of events, if you finished, grading, then you would put a finished and a date and just update that SWIP as you go. If you installed a BMP and you found out that BMP wasn't working, change that in your SWIP,
So it sounds like what you're saying then is that, maybe to keep my map from being congested, I can keep track of little things like that, okay, grading, finish such and such on a.
Yeah, that goes in your SWIP.
Yeah, and then maybe draw actual location of EMPs that have
Yeah.
changed or outfalls that have changed
Yeah.
on a map or something.
Yeah, you've put in curb and gutter, so you don't need the track pad anymore, you put a X through your track pad. And so your BMPs are mostly what you would put on your map. Your other practices and when you finish things and those kinds of changes, put those in your SWIP. you know. But if you know, does that make sense? And things change, and they aren't the way you thought they were gonna be. Once you get out there and you start working, you know, stuff changes. So make sure that that SWIP reflects what you've actually, what you're doing on site, what your site looks like. Make sure your SWIP site map reflects that as well. That's a really common error, and one we hope to get people trained up on so they avoid that particular error.
One more thing.
Yeah.
I'll shut up. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what your anticipation is on the employee training?
Basically, your employees need to know what their responsibilities are in regards to following your SWIP. So they, you know, it might include something like if they're out on their job site and they notice that, oh goodness, this straw wattle is filling up, that they know who to go to, you know, those kinds of things. They also, you know, if you're gonna use, like, I'll use the dirt ramps, for example. I have a company that's now instituting a new policy that those employees need to know that that dirt ramp has to be removed before they leave the job site. So that would be a piece of employee training. And it can be really informal. It can be something like, you know, you could have it on a sheet of paper that's posted on the job site trailer. It just depends, and it looks different for different projects and different construction companies. But basically, you want people to basically know how to kind of follow your SWIP as it relates to their job, so that you're not in violation. So that would be the training piece. If you want to hold formal trainings, go ahead and do it. If you have a morning job site meeting, this is how we go over our safety, this is, you know, what we need to do for the day, you could put a quick blurb in about, and, you know, these are the BMPs that need to be checked, or we had a big rain event last night, so we need to check on those kinds of things.
So basically, it's just making sure that your site staff is knowledgeable of the
Yeah.
permit, the SWIP, and what's required.
We don't want to come on site and say, hey, where is your concrete washout pad? And the superintendent goes, what's a washout concrete pad? I mean, we need to have them to have basic knowledge of the entire plan.
And it will help you avoid things like, I was telling the story about the, you know, site superintendent. I'm on site and we find he had his concrete washout pit, and then we find they washed out all over the site against the fence and into drainages. And he was in violation because the work crews, you know, basically didn't do what they were supposed to do. So your employees need, as it relates to their job, they need to know what the requirements are. And, you know, how are you gonna hold them accountable? I have some that they're subcontractors, they make them sign a statement that says, I will follow the SWIP. And, you know, and then they know what their statements are, and it's completely up to you, how do you wanna manage that, but.
Okay, I think there was some misinterpretation, or there was a higher expectation where they needed to have some official stormwater training type thing or something.
No.
So that's our point clarification.
But it needs to go in your SWIP. What are you gonna do to make sure people know what they need to do, you know, so that it doesn't, because we know they're busy. We know contractors are busy, we know that you're trying to get jobs done, and stormwater gets forgotten. And so if you have, you know, just a kind of general plan, I'm gonna touch on a little something every morning when we do our site, you know, meeting where we go over our plans for the day. Other questions? Yeah.
Are there certain set in stone geographical areas in Wyoming that cannot be deemed inactive, or where you don't have to do a 30-day inspection? Is there places that are hands-off that there's no way that can be? Say you've got an area that is active 6 months out of the year, and the other 6, it's winter, it's snow covered.
So you can't. There is a part in the permit that talks about, it's under inspection schedules, and I think it's in here as weather-related delays, but we also know, you know, like your pipelines, some of those areas are inaccessible. That would be something you would note, and We do real, I mean, we don't want people dying out there because they're trying to go out and conduct an inspection. So we do have provisions in the permit that cover those circumstances. If you can't get out there because of bad weather, you know, it's so muddy that everything's gonna get stuck, you can't get out there. If the site is inaccessible for some reason, that would be something you would note, and you would note that in your inspection documentation, you know, and you need to be specific about why you couldn't reach there. It was so muddy we couldn't, you know, get on site to do our inspection. So then we had to wait until February to do it instead of doing one in January.
So otherwise, it's 30 days.
Yeah, it's 30 days. If you can access that site, it's 30 days, but unless it's inaccessible. And, you know, there are some places that are inaccessible 6 months out of the year, and you would note that, and we understand that.
Is that same weather delay extension, you said 14 days without active construction, you've got to implement stabilization on your site? That same weather delay, we're not gonna have to go out and straw wall when we can't even get there with.
Correct. Right, so the weather delays say operators of projects in remote rural sites that do not have all-season road access may delay inspections until site conditions are appropriate for access. The reason for such a delay must be documented in your SWIP, and inspections must occur as soon as access is feasible. So that's your requirement. You need to document, we couldn't reach it because, you know, the roads were inaccessible due to weather. Yeah.
Also, too, like in the western or some parts of the state, if you know going into it that you're not going to be able to access the site, for example, a client of ours was doing a pipeline in an area that was close to where Big King stipulations, and so they couldn't access it during certain parts of the year. And but it was also happened to be during winter where they wouldn't be able to access it anyways. So they just submitted an alternative inspection plan with their SWIFT application.
And that's something you can fill in, you know, in that section where it gives an inspection schedule. Outline that in your inspection schedule. If you know, like she said, if you know that you cannot access that site between October and May of the year due to, you know, road and weather conditions, then outlet, you know, and submit that as part of your SWIP as an alternative inspection schedule. Yeah.